So good afternoon, everyone. This is Corby Eason from the Utah State Board of Education. I'd like to welcome you to our school-based mental health webinar. And today the webinar is going to cover creating a safe and healthy school. We have this amazing presenter, Jeff Sprague. He has done a lot of work around creating a safe and healthy school. And so I'd like to turn the time over to Jeff.
Are people live? Okay. Hello, everyone. Hope you're doing well today. This is Jeff Sprague from the University of Oregon, and I'm presenting this webinar in collaboration with the Utah Department of Education. And I'm going to talk today about creating safe and healthy schools and talk about a bunch of things. So you can see the title there, and you're welcome to follow up with me at my email address there if that's helpful to you. And I'm going to pause. Are they able to ask a question, or it'll just be they're just observing? Okay, sounds good. So I will be able to make this slideshow available to you as well when we're all done. So been focusing on school safety really since the middle 90s, and kind of before that no one really spent the time talking about school safety in the way that we do now. And so what we're going to do today is explore some history and talk about the elements of a school safety plan, and then add in some new practices, including intervention that may be of help to you in assuring that your schools are safe and healthy for kids. It's a very complex approach to be effective. So we'll learn a few things, and they'll essentially end up with some homework for you. Just a little background on me. I'm a professor of special education at the University of Oregon and director of an entity called the Institute on Violence and Destructive Behavior, which was formed by the Oregon Department of Ed and the Oregon Legislature in 94 and 95 school year to address youth violence and be a center for school safety in Oregon. So we've had research funding in all of the areas listed here, as well as several others. So we've been at this for a long time, and many people think that we have good things to help people with. And again, I encourage you, if you're interested in going deeper in any of these topics, you're welcome to contact me directly or contact the Utah Department of Ed personnel, who have been great colleagues for us. Because of the short nature of our workshop today, the webinar, I want to invoke what many of us in the PBIS world are now focusing on, which is called implementation science. And it's more of a logic. I think we still have a lot to learn about implementation and resistance to wanting to adopt evidence-supported practices. But just a reminder that today we'll be exploring and considering adoption of practices. This is not so much training in how to do it. And one reminder too, in addition to the PowerPoint, you'll have access to a handout with worksheets for some of the pieces of practice that we'll focus on today. So, and if you're more interested in implementation science, you can start with the citation at the bottom of the slide, and then they also have a website. The National Implementation Research Institute is actually in Florida. Good people, and some of my heroes actually work there. So that's a reminder there. If you're on here, you're probably interested in school safety, and I think it's important as we have these discussions that we consider that there are actually two kinds of school safety. One is a focus on preventing and responding to the targeted school shootings, such as most recently famous the Parkland shooting in Florida. And yet much of the research we have really is based on school climate or feelings of safety, certainly bullying and harassment, that sort of thing. So while both are integral and very important to the work, it's important to be clear when we're talking about school safety, which area we're talking about. We could logically say that a school that feels unsafe, that has high rates of bullying, that students are disconnected from adults, maybe or may not be more likely to have a targeted school shooting. But as we'll see, those mass shootings still remain so rare, it's may not be helpful to make a link between the two. So hopefully that idea is helpful. And then the format that will follow largely is first to share with you what we know from the research on school safety. We'll also see some information about needs assessment because it is complex. We really need to be targeted and strategic in how we respond, and we'll see that in the form of what we call a school safety survey. And then we'll also learn a bit about implementation and evaluation of our success. And so you'll see that theme pop up throughout the hour or so that we have together. So first I want to start with a history and overview of school safety. And much has happened since the 90s when we first started to use this language. And yet many things have also not changed as much as we might think. And so this will be helpful as you have local discussions about how safe are our schools, what should we really be concerned with, and things like that. So when we saw the mass shootings in the middle to late 90s, they were really unprecedented in the United States, where we had young people largely in the suburbs. There were school shootings in urban areas before that, but they really were more the one-on-one settling a grudge or gang-related type of things. And we started to see in the middle to late 90s these mass school shootings that seemed to be more indiscriminate than those types of shootings. So we started to see the reactions. For a few years, people said it can't happen here, and now we've seen it happen really in all types of settings, from rural to urban to suburban. Some of us don't want to talk about it because it might not look good to say our school is unsafe, or what there's a federal definition of what's called persistently dangerous in that regard. Because it's so complex, we might say, well, it's pretty hard, so let's not go anywhere. And then recently we've seen a lot of calls for what people call target hardening, the kind of airport type security that we see. Most schools don't want to do that, yet we also have seen a pretty dramatic increase of that since the Sandy Hook shooting and also Parkland. And I'll talk more about that later in the hour. And then obviously from our point of view, we want to do a needs assessment and make an objective, sustainable plan. And while that's an ideal idea, it's complex to pull off because of the nature of the problem itself. So here's some, I call them policy advances or waves of interest in this regard. First were what we call responses to violent juvenile crime and delinquency, and I'll follow this up with some slides afterwards, but this is really in the early 90s. And then we saw the onset of the mass school shootings. During that time, the school discipline initiatives such as school-wide PBIS came into the fore, work we developed at the University of Oregon. We've heard many people talk after a shooting, not just in schools, but any of these mass shootings, that it's a mental health issue, and that can be complex. But we've seen also a lot of writing about the fact that schools are America's #1 children's mental health provider, and yet we rarely get to 1 in 10 kids with the need that are addressed. And that's not the problem of schools, it's a challenge of funding and policy and how those systems work. And then in recent years, we've also seen then concern about the use of exclusionary discipline and the racial, ethnic, and disability disproportionality that we see in the use of that. And that becomes important in the context of school safety when we start talking about the practice of threat assessment and other issues like that. So we'll unpack all of these things as we go, and this is just to set up the next few slides. So many people may not be aware that 1992 is the highest level of violent juvenile crime in the United States. There was a cover of Time magazine predicting a super predator group. It actually never really came to fruition. Part of the reason is that the number of children born 14 years before 1992 was a smaller group, and since 92 the juvenile crime rate dropped to about half and has remained fairly stable with some increases in recent years. And clearly there's a great national concern still about violent juvenile crime, and we'll be able to address that again in addition as we go through the content. Then we saw in the mid to late 90s the mass school shootings. Obviously the most famous during that period was the Columbine shooting. And then we also saw the emergence of adult perpetrators in schools, such as Red Lake or Virginia Tech, Sandy Hook in the 2000s. And during the second Bush administration, George III, the focus on school safety actually moved over to the Office of Homeland Security, right in tandem with the changes in federal practice after 9/11 and the World Trade Center event in that regard. And so there's still a concern for that, and we'll see where that's kind of morphed as well. So one thing to ask maybe when you're talking is, are school shootings getting worse or better? If there is a mass shooting, if you ask 1,000 people the next day, they'll all say school shootings are getting worse. Statistically, it's actually not true, and you can form your own opinion based on the graphs that I'll show you here in a bit. But we do know that the repeated media coverage can create the sense that school shootings are on the rise in that regard, and so we need to be good consumers of the news. And I'm not blaming the media in any way. There's certainly always interest in these terrible events in that regard. And so, in fact, statistically, the number of students killed at school each year has been relatively stable with a couple exceptions, and we'll see this in a graph. And my opinion and observation as a father and a grandfather is that losing even one child in this manner is unacceptable, and we need to keep up the fight to keep our schools safe from particularly these types of events. And so some research, the CDC here is the U.S. Centers for Disease Control, and a few things we know. One is that these shootings tend to occur during transition times, before and after the school day, and during lunch. So if you think about the implications for supervision, the start of semesters, again, transitions, many young people give some type of warning signal, but about half don't. And then the firearms largely come from people they know, including friends, relatives, in that regard. And while there's no comfort in it, homicide is only the second leading cause of death among youth aged 5 to 18. Suicide and even car accidents actually outpace these by quite a bit. And if you want regular updates, you can go to the website that I provided for you and the Centers for Disease Control. Keep that up to date. The national statistics will always be a year or so behind because they carefully vet any data that they publish on that site. And my opinion is, while the national data are interesting, you should always be focused on local data and what's happening local around juvenile crime, violence, those phenomena. So that's important to say. So you can also go to this website, and it's I can't explain why, but it's the Department of the Navy. Here we're seeing the number of school shooting incidents per year since 1970, and you can see that 2018 was the worst by quite a lot. And again, Parkland, and I believe it was San Antonio High School in Texas, really punctuated that particular. But we also see 2006, 1993, 1998 as big years. So as researchers, what we say is statistics turns 1,000 tears into one. And so it's statistically stable, but sure looks like since 2014, things have been persistently pretty awful. And this year so far, as we'll see, there have been 15 so far shooting incidents. This is as of last week on this website. And then the next slide may look similar, but this is the number killed by year. And I'm going to flip back. I hope it's not confusing. 97 shooting incidents in 2018. 56 people died as a result of that. One more flip back. 2019 so far, 15 incidents, and it's March, and there have been only 3 deaths in school so far, and to my knowledge, no mass shootings. So praying that if one of these mass shootings doesn't happen, it may be one of the lower years on record for quite a long time in that regard in terms of people lost. And again, look locally. The national numbers are, for conversation, hard to infer trends there when it's such a low probability event in that regard. This is a different scale, also from the U.S. Centers for Disease Control. The latest national data do come from 2016. But when you start to look at rate per 100,000 of suicide, and this is the child and adult population, you can see it's in the ballpark of 20 plus people per 100,000 kill themselves each year. And we can also see it's suffocation and firearm for the means. And there is an uptick in suicide rates since 2010 overall, and that is a change in trend. That's not a stable pattern that we see there. So important as we talk about the role of mental health and child support that we remain diligently focused also on suicide prevention for our young children in that regard. So some numbers, and I always encourage people to be cautious with these types of numbers, but the point of this slide is to suggest that while we're probably worried and diligent about the probability of a mass shooting, it's a very, very low probability. So lots of young people attend U.S. schools. There's about 100,000 public schools in the United States. Baffling number, and this is a U.S. Department of Education calculation that the odds of a fatal school shooting at your school are about 1 in 614 million. For some reason, I think because I'm a human, that doesn't make me feel any more safe in a school. And so that's something to, as leaders in your district and people that are involved in your schools, is to be mindful of how much your own fear and concern is driving suggestions for strategy in that regard. So it's a question we can't answer with data or statistics in that regard. So one piece of historical note is in 2000, after Columbine, actually the United States Secret Service got involved in school safety and specifically threat assessment. And I'll assume that many of your schools are conducting threat assessments. If not, we strongly recommend that you have a objective threat assessment protocol. And I'll give you some of the research on that as we go along. But clear back in 2002, even the Secret Service said we might better spend our resources on prevention and not rely exclusively on law enforcement to respond to and resolve school-based attacks. So it's just not possible for example, a single officer which is probably a pretty common model across our schools, maybe even in urban areas, to be in all places at once in that regard. So the transition here is, well, how do we decide what to do then? And if you're imbued or involved in the approach of positive behavior interventions and supports, or PBIS, in the middle 90s, through some meetings I was involved in and our colleagues, we decided to adopt and promote the public health approach, the 3-tier model in schools, and that seems to have been a pretty good idea. So this is just a reminder of that we want to define the problem, and again, what are you working on? Is it targeted violence, or is it other forms of violence, as you see listed there? We can identify risk and protective factors, and I'm going to give you a vehicle for doing that and also explain what a risk and protective factor is. Then develop and choose and test our strategy and evaluate the outcome. So that becomes an iterative or a circular or a feedback loop type of approach. We think it's the most effective, and it also aligns with what community, even national strategy is around protecting the safety and well-being of all of our citizens in the United States. And so to bring us back to the flow, and then we'll go deeper into the assessment piece, is that we suggest that you do some needs assessment, and I'm going to teach you about something called the Oregon School Safety Survey. And you can change the name and call it the Utah School Safety Survey. In PBIS.org, we also it's known as the School Safety Survey. So if you're using any of the center-developed tools on a website called PBIS Apps, you'll know that as the School Safety Survey, and you can use it. It's always been free, and excuse me, each year I get about a dozen dissertations that want to use the School Safety Survey, and they're always asking for permission, even though it says right on it you can use it however you want. A second factor then is there's an area of architecture called crime prevention through environmental design, and that's the science and practice of designing environments so there's ease of surveillance and things like that. So we'll introduce that to you, give you a little bit of information about the role of police in schools and some research to go so you can inform your own decisions about that locally. We obviously need a school violence response plan if the unthinkable does occur, and then a follow-up crisis plan. And it should fit here. I think I just forgot to edit that out, so you can, I'll edit that out for you. The next piece that we'll focus on is screening and identifying at-risk students. So embedded in the school safety work is a practice called threat assessment, and many of you are probably pursuing the practice now of multi-tiered support systems, or MTSS. There's a threat assessment will be a reactive assessment that's conducted after a student makes a threat. What we're going to recommend today is that you also consider screening beforehand students who might be at risk for making threats or other forms of dangerous behavior. And the goal then is to help you understand how these types of assessments fit together, one, to, on a proactive or preventive manner, provide supports before you need to do a threat assessment. And then it also speaks to how we use the outcomes of a threat assessment to design what happens next. So a big message will be, do the best you can to decouple the practice of threat assessment, essentially with suspension and expulsion. So what we're learning from the research is a lot of young people who make a threat then essentially get kicked out of school. And a difficult set of decisions, but we'll give you the best that we know there as well. Then we'll give a little voice to school-wide climate through PBIS and other practices. Won't spend much time there, but only to do it in the service of helping you see how this all fits together. A big issue around school safety, too, is the presence and experience of bullying and harassment, and we'll learn more about that. And then I'll close just with some referrals to resources about supporting antisocial and potentially violent youth. Again, a big issue in discussion is mental health. Do we know if mental health can prevent or treat potentially violent youth? There's some things we know, a lot we don't know. Even what's the role of functional behavior assessment and individual PBIS plans, and then a final piece about the role of suspension and expulsion around school violence in this regard. So what we're going to learn about now is the Oregon School Safety Survey, and then we'll roll through the rest of this content as well. And thanks for your attention so far. So we actually developed the Oregon School Safety Survey back in the middle 90s. We were, if you will, predicting the future. That's what we get to do as academics in that regard. And so this is just a slide just shows us how these pieces fit together. And a graphic that we came up with is the one we see here. We call them sources of vulnerability to school settings. And because school shootings in particular are so rare, but they can happen anywhere, we need to be mindful of all the multiple aspects of school safety. So one, if we start on the left, is the design, use, and supervision of school space. This will come from the crime prevention through environmental design technology. And I've got a great resource to share with you that the federal government now makes available for free. But, you know, if you've been to an airport lately, you see some common security measures there, such as metal detectors, x-rays. We're not advocating that. Most schools don't want the school to look like a fortress. It would make a difference if you had that sort of high security, but as citizens in the U.S. seem to be willing to balance the desire for a positive feeling school with some of that, what people call target hardening, but not completely. The yellow one, the next one to the right, the administrative and management practices of the school. We do know there's a relation between school climate. I call this the PBIS column. There is a relation between how safe and supported students feel, and teachers as well, other staff in the building. If it's a positive school climate, there's less likely to be violence, and one of the arguments is if we all know each other better, we'll also be more sensitive to changes in a person's behavior where they might be planning harm to others, etc., in that regard. Then the final piece is and again, unfortunate news, but lower income neighborhoods tend to have more violence, tend to have more juvenile delinquency, tend to have more office referrals, suspensions and expulsions, and also have lower academic achievement. So if we're aware of the characteristics of our neighborhoods, our parents, our students, we can't always fix that in the short run, but it does have impact perhaps on how we prioritize our limited resources to make a difference in that regard. So the School Safety Survey has 17 risk factors and 16 protective factors, and then just an opportunity for additional comments. In the handout that you'll have access to, there's a copy of the survey in there, and I recommend, if you're going to engage in a planning process, maybe with your site council or if there's a school safety committee, but ask as many people as you can to kind of get their vote about what their school safety concerns are. So the next two slides will do two things. One is they'll tell you what a risk and protective factor is, and then also show you the examples of those as they are presented on the school safety survey. And so these have held up well, and if you're a student of instrument design, the scales on this survey are really clean as a whistle. There's a clear risk scale and there's a clear protective factor scale, so we did good homework on this. So in public health, a risk factor is a variable or something that people experience excuse me, that increases the risk of negative outcome in the future. So obviously, illegal weapons, gang activities, lots of delinquent youth, crimes in and around the school would predict an increased probability of a negative outcome in the school, such as a school shooting or more fighting or things like that. And what we do on the safety survey is simply ask people from not at all a concern to an extensive concern at each item. What's your opinion about that? And people will often say, well, it's just perception. But it turns out, and you just have to believe me on this, that the collective perception of what's needed in the school through the use of a survey like the school safety survey turns out to be a pretty good predictor. And I'll give you some more advice about that as we go. The second factor then is protective factors. And protective factors are somewhat conceptually opposite in that they can buffer against risk exposure. So there's the buffering effect. And then the real gift of protection, which is, I think, is what every parent hopes for their children, is if you nurture them and provide enough positive support that they will never engage in certain behaviors. So it's prevention of the onset. So, for example, we hope our children won't use drugs. And so these protective factors, if they're exposed to them, might help prevent them from ever stepping off the ladder, if you will, type of thing. Heroin use. Certain things in some cultures, such as alcohol use, is considered age appropriate, but we can also use protection to at least delay the onset of that behavior, hopefully until the legal age of consumption in that regard. So I'm just using those as examples. Risky sexual behavior, the same type of thing. None of us would be there without intimate contact, but we're trying to delay the onset of that behavior with our kids till what our society and cultures consider to be the appropriate time. So the protective factors in a lot of ways are kind of a dual gift in that way. And then we found this to hold pretty true. Most schools will rate, if you add up all those factors and get an average score, we see that most schools at different levels will say that protection outstrips risk in that regard. And again, if you do it locally, you'll find out at your own school what the key factors are that people think they're concerned about. And then in this particular study we did, you can see bullying, which makes a lot of sense from the data on school shooters, and then physical facilities. So go back to that, thinking about crime prevention through environmental design. And this was a study of literally all the school administrators in Oregon. And we heard from about 80% of them because we worked through the Administrators Association. And so we got a good turnaround rate. Interestingly, poverty, transiency, and child abuse in the home were also top concerns, but those are also outside of the purview or influence of the school itself. And so if I worked in Oregon, which I do, I'd be focusing on bullying and deteriorating facilities there. In terms of protective factors, again, you saw response to conflict, suicide prevention, staff development, academic expectations, and parent involvement. So good targets. Now I'm going to try to make sense in front of a web audience. One thing I recommend for planning purposes is to take your highest rated risk factors, say the top 3 to 5. So in other words, the one that you think are the most extensive or influential risk factors, and then take your lowest rated protective factors. So, we need more extracurriculars, or we need more teacher-student relations, and make a plan out of that. So once you've chosen your intervention targets, then you also want to compare it with hard data, archival data. So, for example, if juvenile crime is a concern, your local police department or juvenile authority can actually give you information about those patterns, right? If child abuse and by definition then child trauma appears to be impacting your school, then you can work with your local authorities to learn more about what's actually going on and what they might see as an appropriate point of intervention for your school, and that we want to use it annually to check progress or change. And so we've had that going for a long time, and it's a pretty good place to start. So it's not the end, it's the beginning, and should be used in an iterative fashion in that regard. All right, switching over, crime prevention through environmental design. We actually wrote a book about it in 2000, which was published by the Eric Clearinghouse on educational management. That entity was defunded in the middle 2000s, and so if any of you want it, email me and I can send you a PDF of it. And but I'll give you some other resources as well. So consider in your school, like, how do kids move around? Are there hotspots for misbehavior? Are there certain businesses? I know in Springfield, Oregon, for many years, across the street from a high school was a store that primarily sold tobacco and alcohol, and they finally got the school to, that was a risk factor we could get rid of by asking this business to relocate. Easy to say, but you get that. Is there illegal trespassing or intrusion? So be mindful of access control. I was in a school in New Mexico a few weeks ago, and they were proud of this big pavilion they had established at the front end of the school with bulletproof glass and locked door access to the school building. And later that day, with the district special education director, we walked in the back door, which was unlocked. And so we gave them some advice about considering access control of the whole building, not just the front door type of thing. So I'm not able to show this video to you because of some internet connectivity issues, but this particular video is from PBS, Public Broadcasting System, and gives a pretty good coverage about what people call target hardening. And so our view on this, and our view of the research, doesn't mean that we're correct. It just means that it's our opinion, is it may be better to invest in people rather than technology, and you just have to make that decision locally. I provided you with a citation, a summary of some of the studies done on the effectiveness of these safety measures, and then also it's a blog posting. It's about 2,500 pages, and the title is called "Why Security Measures Won't Stop School Shootings," and it's under a website called The Conversation, which is it's an academically vetted blog, so that you can't write for them unless you have a research-supported set of opinions. I've written for them around bullying and harassment. So those are just two sources for you to consume as you pursue your role around school safety in the school. And I just want to mention again, I think this is an emotional issue. Maybe some people may feel safer if there's hardened targets, such as a security glass, or how doors are locked in the buildings. All these things can affect how we feel during the school day. And yet we know nationally it's very hard if someone wants to come in and do some real damage with a gun. It's very difficult to stop it completely. But that, again, that's a local decision that needs to be made there. And a great federal resource is called Site Assess, and it's called the REMS Technical Assistance Center. REMS stands for Rapid Emergency Management System. And there's a number of tools for educators there. I strongly recommend, if you're involved in school safety efforts in your school, is to go on the REMS site. In general, you can log in and get email updates and resource updates. And this particular piece called Site Assess is something you can download on your mobile phone, and it allows you to walk around the building and actually take pictures of like the doors or areas where there might be concentrations of kids misbehaving or poor supervision. And then it gives you a checklist that you can then essentially download and share with those who might be involved in planning. So pretty cool that we can have a tool that's portable and free from the U.S. Department of Ed. So recommend that you take a look at that. One of the things we've seen actually since about the middle 2000s is about the percent of schools reporting that they have police presence is upwards to about half the schools in the U.S. have some security presence. After Parkland, the current administration has moved some funds around to make more of that target hardening funding available, type of thing. And again, after Sandy Hook, after the Parkland shooting, there's always a surge in this stuff. One resource that I think is important to look at too is the National Association of School Resource Officers. And it's tricky here as well because some people have different opinions because of their political views. There's data about the functionality of police in schools. And one admonition I have as your presenter today is if you have a school resource officer or other police presence in schools, is make sure the agreement and the protocol about what that individual does in their role is very clear and also prescribed. And I'm going to show you some data which really supports that. So what I've seen commonly, because we helped install it in my own community back in 1995, is nobody really knew what to do. And so they just let the officer kind of figure it out. And we're kind of past that era now. I think the officers are all good and caring people, but it's very important, I think, to have some kind of a contractual agreement that clearly specifies what the officer does and does not do in their role as a school resource officer. And a couple of studies, one from the Brookings Institution, which is a think tank, well-known think tank, frankly considered to be a liberal think tank, and you're going to see some of the criticism coming from that side, if you will. But this is a study we're seeing from North Carolina, which after Parkland, their legislature passed quite a bit of funding, essentially encouraging schools to invest more in policing. And we see a few findings that it doesn't lead to perceptions of safer schools in the North Carolina study. It actually does amplify racial disparities in arrests by SROs. And that's, want to be clear, we don't think it's because the SROs have issues of bias. They're just present, right? If you add police to your community, it's well known in public planning work, you'll have more arrests just because you have more people to observe and write tickets, if you will. So the bigger predictor in this study of school violence was actually the income level of the students. And so again, I can't give you an answer there other than to refer you to the resource about that particular policy. And then again, the NASRO group, the resource at the bottom there, is a great group. And if your own local school resource officer is not aware of that group, they provide training and guidance to school resource officers, and really the best resource that we're aware of in that regard. Final piece, then again, these are more homework assignments, which would be, you need to do whole staff development activities around this. So my job today in the webinar is to give you the package so you can go back and invest as you see fit. The REMS site, again, also gives you guidance on a crisis response plan. And again, for you as a practitioner to ask, do you know what your response plan is? Do you know what the follow-up plan is? Because, kids and families and teachers and everyone will be traumatized. And so things like safe rooms and other practices like that, there's actually much known about this now. The role of practice drills, and make sure you know what your job is in that area. And again, the RIMS site has some great resources for that if you're not aware of, or if your school district or school is looking to upgrade your practice in that regard. Okay, next piece then we're going to make another switch to screening, and this will follow into a threat assessment. And some questions for you to ask, maybe after the webinar. Do you know what the threat assessment protocol is? Do you know the difference between what we call substantive and transient threats? You will by the time we're finished here. What happens to kids after they make a threat? And we'll call the question, is there a role for suspension or expulsion? And I already know the answer to this because I only know of one state that requires it. But do you know what happens to kids, and does your school or district make public what happens to kids after they make a threat? And I'm not, obviously, in small districts, you got to be careful how you report it, because if it becomes famous, then everybody's going to know who that young person is. But I also think, in my opinion, we are losing some really important background knowledge about the impact of our practices if we don't look at it in an anonymous way as a pattern. And I'll show you what that looks like from one state, which is Virginia. So this is meant to be humorous, for whom the bell curve tolls. So we've often waited until a child is in pretty deep trouble to do any kind of screening, and yet in a MTSS sort of preventive framework, we also suggest that we, like hearing assessment or vision assessment, that we on the front end assess regularly what the needs of our kids are. And as my slide says, if you say we already know who they are, you might be introducing bias due to the lack of procedural clarity. So let's explore this just a bit and see if how it floats. In PBIS, we wanted schools to give each other database feedback about discipline, and so we landed on looking at office discipline referrals, because most of us track these in some way. But what we've also learned over the years is it's a way to fail. We don't refer quiet kids to the office who may have mental health issues or be the sort of ticking time bomb. And there is some evidence of teacher or system bias unless you meet the criteria that we've laid out in some of the literature about the validity of office referrals as a data source. So the thing to remember is that it's kind of what the kid did, but it's also kind of how the adult coded it, and then what ultimately gets written down. Some behaviors like disruption or defiance are, in a legal sense, considered kind of subjective. So if I'm angry at the kid, I might call it defiance. If I'm just a little bit upset, I might just call it disruption. But you can see where that bias can kind of carry through without a clear written protocol for the work. And so that's the job of PBIS. What this shows, if you just take your kids and rank order them, you can see in this school they said, well, by the time you get 5, we probably ought to be looking at you more. And so you can see the kids above the red line on the far right, and everybody knows who that last 2 kids are with 17 office referrals that year, type of thing. But it starts to illustrate the use of a criteria for moving ahead. And the practice is called universal screening, and we're seeing it adopted much, much more across the country. And the practices include a teacher nomination, some form of brief behavior rating, and one of the pioneers in this area is my colleague and mentor, Hill Walker, other people like Frank Gresham at Louisiana State. So because teachers who nominate or rate kids may still carry some bias through We also want to use our archival records, such as attendance, uh, 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 behavior, and coursework. So it helps me remember by the ABC type of thing. So if the teacher says the house is on fire, the kid's terrible, but his attendance is pretty good and behavior's not so bad in the office, then maybe we haven't achieved convergence there and need to help the teacher more with things like classroom management. This particular graphic, if you look on the far left column, over many years of research, we've found that these are the top 9 teacher preferred behaviors. So if you see the adaptive column, comply promptly, follow rules, control anger, ask for help, do your best work. These are the soft opening signs of children who maybe are the least good at these in your classrooms, may also be telling us that they have potential for other issues. So we want to base our behavior ratings on this work. And so you can see both peer and teacher related adjustment. And I like to tell people that if you have PBIS school rules such as be safe, be respectful, be responsible, this is where we derived those 3 words. None of us could remember 18 adaptive behaviors, 9 plus 9, so we wintered it down to be safe, be respectful, be responsible. And these also become really important social skill targets, if you will, too. So if we know a teacher likes a compliant kid, then teach the kid to say, yes, I'll do that. Sure, I'll do that. That's what I heard the other day. Yeah, I'd be glad to do that. I do that with my wife all the time. It works pretty well. Control anger, right? That can be taught. Ask for help. That can be directly taught. So you can start to see where these become teaching targets as well, which is kind of a side benefit that we've learned from the screening protocols. So one part here is meant to be funny, but we want, then this is a recommendation in our school, and my opinion is this should be from a district level, that you can see maybe where it would be problematic to say that each school makes up their own criteria for who gets Tier 2 support versus Tier 3 support. We might be introducing different forms of bias in that regard. So just the example, Tier 1, if you're breathing, if you're alive, you all get exposed to the School 1 stuff. Maybe by the time you get your 3rd office referral, we have the teacher fill out a brief behavior rating, and we look at attendance, behavior, coursework. And if all that hangs together, then yes, we can say you need additional support. Then what you see in the addition of Tier 3 basically is maybe we tried some Tier 2 stuff, maybe we've collected more ODRs, and then we've also, in addition to the archival data, would conduct a functional behavior assessment. And in our work, because we originated the first guides for that, is FBA does not need only be applied in the way of thinking functionally, not only to special ed students, but for any student who has a Tier 3 need, including a mental health issue. And you have people in your state that are quite expert with that, including my good friend and colleague Rob O'Neill at the University of Utah, and a lot of good resources here at the Department of Ed too in that regard. So again, one of the pushes in the equity era then of discipline is to have that clear criteria for who needs those additional supports. So the next piece then, and then I'm going to show you one of the screening tools, and I'll also give you a list of other places to look as you're exploring, is to have some kind of a request for assistance. And there's a full version of this in your handout packet. One feature here that we like is, if you note, we're not asking the teacher what they've tried, because most teachers will say, I've tried everything, that's why I filled out the form. So it is an alternative. We ask them to fill out the child's schedule. This is an elementary student. If you're a secondary student, you'd fill out like teacher opening, teacher lecture, group work, seat work, whatever those routines are within the classroom, and then rate which one is the child most likely to misbehave. Then we focus the rest of our work on those high-rated routines or periods, if you will. And I can't go deeper than that here, but that helps focus our work rather than trying to assess or fix the kid for the whole day, which is a pretty tall order. Then this what we're going to see in the next 3 slides is what's called the Walker Survey Instrument, and we have permission for you to use it or try it out. And if you look on the left-hand side of the column, and then at the top it says examples of externalizing types of behaviors, and it gives examples of those. And then as we go down the column, we see non-examples. So externalizing is a commonly described dimension, essentially acting out kids. We're not looking for kids that are cooperative, that sort of thing. The task here is to ask the teacher to write down the names of the first 5 kids that come to mind. It's important also to limit that they can't do more than 5. If a teacher says 20 kids in my room are the worst kids that ever lived, that's when you send them to classroom management class. So it's a different diagnostic in that regard. And then in the world of mental health, we often talk about young people with internalizing issues such as depression, low activity levels, things like that. And teachers will always have a harder time writing down the names of 5 of those kids, but we're trying to put a balance in there with the work. And then the next slide, and it's also in your packet, shows an elementary version. And the way you use those colored boxes is, so item 1 is other children seek child out to involve him or her in activities. That's an example of peer-related adjustment. So you put the number from 1 to 5 in the peer box, and then uses free time appropriately as school-related adjustment, and you put that number in the school box. What you can do then is add up the scores at the bottom, or you can get a grand total. And the basic logic here is the kids with the lower scores have more risk and should be looked at more deeply. So you can see it's a form of screening on the front end. And then the next page, which is hard to see on your slide, but you have it in your packet, is the adolescent version. So after you explore this, and if any of you are interested in using it or adopting it, I can also get you access to the implementation manual. One of the things to look forward to, too, is you're going to start to see the onset of electronic versions of these tools. That'll make it much more easy and much more likely for people to actually use them. One that we developed, and again, this is not commerce, I'm not marketing, is a progress monitoring tool. It's an online tool. My colleague Kathleen Lane in Kansas has another list of screening tools, and you can go to that website. The next 2 are cool because they have student self-report versions. So the Behavioral and Emotional Rating Scale, or the BERS, which does have a cost. I think they cost about 20 cents each if you buy a box of them. And then the Strengths and Difficulties Questionnaire, which is used across the world, is actually free. So let's say, for example, you've got concern about a young person. Maybe they've made a threat, or you think they're about to make a threat. If they're old enough, usually grade 6 and up, you can actually give them the BERS or the SDQ, the Strengths and Difficulties Questionnaire, and have them rate themselves. So that turns out to be, if effort is a concern, that's a way to cut that down. And then a very complex one, but a really good one, is the Social Skills Rating Scale. So I don't mean to be exclusive with any of those, but those are just kind of Jeff Sprague's favorite list for spring of 2019. So I'm going to skip this activity, but do it at home. And when you get there, I'm going to switch over to threat assessment. And so where are we in the stream of this? We're going to talk about threat assessment, and then move to some conversation about intervention. So the only state in the country, to my knowledge, and I've asked many people, that requires anonymous reporting of the threat assessment data actually is Virginia. And so the only systematic research we have on threat assessment comes from Virginia. So I'm sure Utah has an adopted threat assessment protocol, or your district does. So I'm in no way suggesting that you throw out what you're doing and adopt what I'm about to show you. They all have pretty common features, and so you won't necessarily, it won't necessarily change your protocol, assuming that you have one. But there's quite a bit of research. Dewey Cornell is a colleague of ours, and he's also a school psychologist. And so the citations that you have are from him. At the bottom of this slide also is a very short, about 2.5-minute YouTube video talking about the role of threat assessment, if you'd like to share that with people. They also shared some guidelines back in 2004, and I'll also give you the U.S. Secret Service just this summer, published some revised guidelines about threat assessment, and you'll have that website to go to, type of thing. So big message from Dewey is there was this thought that there's this like consistent profile of a school shooter. It just doesn't bear out in the research. Some people will say, well, it's almost all white males. Yes, that's true, but there's more detail than that, and not a good way, because there's a lot of white males in schools that don't shoot up the school. So this is basically the logic of the tip of the iceberg, right? That the tip is we're using threat assessment to punish or exclude kids, but we also might overreact based on the nature and the severity of the threat, and I'll show you what that means in just a minute. But there's all these characteristics floating underneath the water, if you will, that need to be discovered during a threat assessment. So these bullets come from the U.S. Secret Service type of thing, and I'm not going to read each bullet. That's one of my commitments as a presenter. The way to do it is to identify threats and evaluate the seriousness, and then intervene and follow up. And I'm going to move to this. It's a different type of pyramid. In the Virginia database, the likelihood of transient threats, or ones that would not have resulted in school violence, is about 12-1 over substantive threats, which could result in violence or a shooting, for example. So one piece of good news is kids will say dumb or inappropriate stuff, if you will, and most of it is not beyond an initial assessment, will be considered a substantive threat that may be carried out. You also see from Dewey's data, and this is a more recent upgrade, is that threats to harm others tend to really kind of peak, start peaking in grade 4, and then fall off in grade 10, 11, and 12. Typically what we might infer is that after 9th grade, the kids most at risk might be have dropped out of school or withdrawn in some other way in that regard. So 2 things to learn. One is called a transient threat. It's basically words, and you can see there. And in the Virginia data, we see that transient threats tend to peak in the early grades. So grades 2, 3, 4, they're not completely gone, a few more in early middle school type of thing, but they fairly well go away as kids get older. Then there's substantive threats, which are the ones that would be of most concern to us. And we see in the pattern here that they tend to get distributed in the later grades, middle school through about grade 9 again. And then this graph just arrays the 2 data sets together. So one piece that Dewey really advocates is against suspending very young children for making transient threats. And that's going to be emotionally difficult if you're a school administrator or a parent of the child who was the object of the threat. And we need to be aware of what the data patterns are. I can't give you more than that in a short period of time. So again, older kids, if the kid really has a plan, the witnesses really, are they credible? And obviously, when in doubt, treat the threat as substantive. Just more details about this on this slide. I'm going to change my pace just a bit, just a little self-monitoring of my time available. And then one thing to consider just locally is if we help people understand that threat assessment is concerned with future danger and discipline is concerned with consequences for behavior, a threat may pose little danger, yet merits serious disciplinary consequences. So we're trying to encourage us to not simply exclude a kid to alternative ed or to expulsion or long-term suspension based on their behavior. Now that's a good logic, but you should be aware you're going to have a lot of emotions around that set of decisions. So all I can do is give you the information that we have. I've also given you some additional threat assessment resources. Again, the U.S. Secret Service Threat Assessment Guide came out this summer, brand new in that regard. And then NASP is the National Association of School Psychologists. Probably most of you are using your school psych as a person involved in the threat assessment process. Okay, last salvo here is the role of intervention. And in the beginning, tier one, we want to impact the school climate. And I've left out the slides about PBIS just in the interest of time here. But one piece to cover in deeper detail is the risk factor of bullying and harassment. And in our view, transforming this peer culture could be the most difficult thing that we do in schools around violence prevention. The early studies showed that 2/3 of the mass school shooters were chronic and severe bully victims. So it's a correlate, not a cause, but certainly one that we can address directly through intervention. What do we know about the effectiveness? This is a very short summary. We can make an effect in the short term, but the long-term effectiveness is not so promising. Basically, what that shows is that we don't stick with the efforts that work to prevent bullying. And so that's a disappointment, but we know if we work in schools, it's hard to sustain things. Traditional bullying is more likely amongst males. Females tend to be more what people call social aggression. And this is just one of a handful of studies that can give you these sort of meta-analyses of bullying prevention. And this is the most widely adopted bully program in the world is called the OVEUS. It's OLWEUS. It's Dan Oveus. He's a Norwegian guy. He's also a jazz piano player, so I know him a little bit. And he developed this in Norway because some young men there killed themselves after being chronic and severe bully victims. So the point of this slide is there's the person who's the victim, is the Y there in the middle. And an important admonition is to don't call a kid a bully, call them a kid who bullies. Don't personalize it. But we see a big role then for the bystanders or the hench people or the minions, to borrow from recent popular culture. But bystanders can be a big part of protection, kind of in that regard. And I'll give you some research if you're interested in how it breaks down racially, ethnically. I'm sharing this because I'm an author on the darn thing, but I'm going to just give you some feedback here, and you can go read this. We were funded by actually requested by the U.S. Department of Ed to go a little bit deeper in terms of what kids believe and see in school, and there's a few things to focus on, and then there's a closing slide that I'll give you. But one is that kids think bullying is normal because it's happening so much, And they often don't think that adults that care because you might be standing there and not even see it. And so one target for bully prevention is to make sure the adults know what they're looking for. Kids who also persist to be victims, even people that like them, tend to view them as deserving it because they didn't do anything about it. Pretty insidious. The Columbine young men, for example, other kids that were that way. So we have to be really careful about observing it, taking reports, and things like that. So, and kids also tell us that kids who bully get what they want. So you can get social status from that. So kids also told us what's not helpful, right? Don't talk to the whole class about my problem with that other kid. Don't just talk to the kid who bullied, right? Say you're sorry right now. Not a good way to go. And don't tell me to fix my behavior, okay? And law would support this too. If you're a bully victim, you need to be helped and protected and not be told to change your behavior so it'll go away, which still goes on in schools, type of thing. And then defining what's tattling versus telling is also important. So again, support the kid, right? Support the young person who's telling you they're being a bully, a victim, and these are embedded. So not surprising, we suggest two integrated approaches. One is school-wide PBIS, and then the adoption of a social skills program such as Second Step or a bully prevention program such as the OVEAS program. While none of the programs show dramatic effectiveness, many of them do show sufficient effectiveness to be considered adopted. I've just completed a National Institute of Justice funded study combining PBIS and the OVEAS bully prevention program in one of these fancy studies called the randomized trial. And the study's over. It's not published yet, but we got really good results. Kids reported a lot less bullying, victimization. Adults liked it. So we'll be able to give the field some quite positive information about the integration of these two approaches in the very near future. And if you don't need a peer-reviewed journal article, call me up and I'll give it to you. So that's all good in that regard. And then we won't do it for today, but it's kind of a checklist for an educator, right? Do you have such a program? Do you know what the extent of bullying is in your school? What's your policy? What do you do if a kid reports an incident to you? Who do you report it to, right? Do you have a specific plan? Have kids been taught how to report bullying? Do they know how to respond? And what do you do when a kid won't stop, which is pretty common? So those are really just fuel for discussion. It's from a book that we wrote, type of thing. And again, some more evidence-supported bully prevention approaches are there for you. And the bottom one is encouraging because in a study in Maryland, my colleague Catherine Bradshaw and Phil Leaf, just by implementing Tier 1 PBIS, they found reductions in bullying behaviors in those schools that did it well. So that's pretty cool in that regard. Okay, I think maybe one more big thing, and then I've got a great quote for you at the end. So this is some of the hardest stuff in a lot of ways. So I'll give you a few tidbits, right? First of all, let's acknowledge it takes longer than we'd like to get results with our toughest kids. And we can reduce behavior problems, but it's unlikely that they'll be eliminated. And in many of our schools, the individualization required to be successful, not everyone's willing to put in that effort because they're angry and outraged at the student. And these are discussions we need to have locally, very much so. What we would like is, I'm up there at the 1,000. I give a consequence, and in a rapid amount of time, the child never misbehaves again. What you actually get looks more like this. We're 60 days into the intervention. The kid's better, but we've essentially got him to bottom of average of classroom expectations. When someone in my role says you have a program that's effective, when you look inside the intervention, it probably looks more like this. This is important and significant, But kids that are tough will remain tough even in the face of intervention, and it takes a long time to recover from that. So we know it's a lot of kids, and there are concerns in society about there's so many now, and some of the U.S. Department of Ed studies tell us this, and these are some of the most expensive studies ever conducted. And the questionnaire asked by the U.S. Department of Ed is not just IEP or federally recognized disability, but kids with mental health issues and all that stuff. So the predicted number is about 1 in 5 kids. So, or on any given day, about 1 in 10 kids are going to be having a pretty significant problem or getting over that. And so a question to ponder around school safety is, how do we organize our schools to be more efficiently responsive to every 5th kid in the school, right? It's not just an annoyance anymore. It's a big population of kids in the school. And so, because what we found is that if we only respond to the toughest kids, because some people will say, well, let's just get rid of those kids in our school, will be better. But kids need a village to return to, and like it or not, we're it. And kids that adjust well are able to return to the village. That may be controversial to those of you out there, but it's very much true from the research. So just in closing, and just a few slides, and I'm going to skip some and apologize for that, but you can have the whole deck. 3 big areas, right? One is the role of mental health supports, other forms of intensive intervention, such as those guided by functional behavior assessment, and then the role of suspension and expulsion alternatives. And I'm going to just step out for a minute and give you just a couple key slides. If you're looking for evidence-based interventions, you can go to these websites. One is called the National Center on Intensive Intervention, the What Works Clearinghouse, and also the Castle Group if you're interested in social and emotional skills. And obviously pbis.org, the bottom piece includes check in, check out. We've got our own Leanne Hawken here at University of Utah that's key. And then for mental health, you can also go to the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration. They have a guide of mental health treatments in schools. And then also the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. And then another menu for kids with internalizing problems, particularly the top 3, coping with depression, CBITS, or cognitive behavioral intervention for trauma in schools, and then Strong Kids and Strong Teens are great resources for those kids who might be more quiet. And then for mental health and externalizing behaviors, a couple places to go looking. I'm not saying these are the only ones, but good examples. One is called the Family Checkup from our sadly deceased this summer, Tom Deshawn. Some of the best work with families that's tied through a family center in schools, multi-systemic therapy, aggression replacement training, and multidimensional treatment foster care. So, because we need to acknowledge that with our toughest kids, maybe school-based intervention on its own is not sufficient. So you're going to see a change in the screen. Maybe we can edit it out later as I skip a few slides. It's all very interesting. Okay. So just want to close with these thoughts. And again, thank you for your attention, and I hope this has been helpful. And please follow up with your Department of Ed colleagues, including Carol Anderson, who's sitting right here. And I would have said that if she wasn't sitting here. But just a reminder of what have we done in the last hour or so. Again, there's a lot to know in this field, and I spent my career trying to know it all, and I still don't know it all in that regard. So just a few thoughts to leave you with. One is that school safety is incredibly complex, and it includes factors outside of schooling and should extend beyond popular single-item solutions, such as increased policing or increased mental health support. There's evidence for and against policing. There's certainly a lot of evidence in favor of mental health support, and yet we also know we're woefully inadequate in our ability to provide those supports to our young kids. Not a reason to stop. Just a reminder about the public health approach, a summary of the safe schools elements, and then my closing slide involves this guy. When I was a boy and I would see scary things in the news, my mother would say to me, look for the helpers. You'll always find people who are helping. To this day, especially in times of disaster, I remember my mother's words, and I'm always comforted by realizing there are so many helpers, so many caring people in this world. So just want to close by saying you're on this webinar because you're a helper, and thank you for that, and keep up the good fight. So thanks a lot, and you can follow up with me through Carol Anderson or directly through my email on the very first slide, and I'll always copy Carol on that so she knows that you're asking about stuff. So thanks. Hope it was helpful.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for participating in this webinar. We'll see you again on April 10th at 2:30 p.m. to 4 p.m. And we look forward for your participation for next webinar.